Trying to explain what is happening in an ongoing war can be difficult. Predicting what might happen next, that's even harder. One way we can attempt to determine that is to assess the theory of victories in play on each side. That is, what is each side trying to achieve, and broadly speaking, what is their theory on how to get there? Is it by seizing the enemy capital and overthrowing the government, for example? Or is it just a matter of endurance and attrition until the will to continue on the other side fails? And once you've determined a potential theory of victory, the second question becomes, is it practical or even possible? Do you have the resources and capabilities necessary to turn theory into reality? Russia in early 2022, for example, seems to have had a theory of victory, but not the capability to make it happen. When we talk about the war in Ukraine on this channel or try to assess its potential future progress, usually I'm going to focus on the material and the quantitative, counting platforms, assessing production, financial resources, and all the other mechanical inputs that go into a war effort. But almost every time I add a caveat about the importance of these social and political factors as well. That having enough equipment and material to sustain a war effort very much helps, but that if your government collapses or the population loses the will to fight, then having a spare 9,000 T-14 tanks isn't going to help you. The problem with trying to model those sort of social and political considerations is that people are complicated, and so I generally leave discussion of those factors to more specialised experts. And so today I'm actually at the Royal Danish Defence College, interviewing Danish military analyst and fellow YouTuber Anders Puck Nielsen. And as part of that discussion, we'll be talking about both Russia and Ukraine's theories of victory, what they are, how realistic they might be, and critically how Russian political and social factors might help inform how both Ukraine and Russia choose to fight this war, and how it might proceed as a result. To do that, we'll have a quick discussion about how Ukraine and Russia are currently fighting this war, how leaders in Moscow and Kyiv might think of the purpose of the current fighting, and what clues that might give us as to their currently prevailing theory of victory. Then I'll ask Anders to explore the political and social questions on the Russian side a little more closely. How is the war perceived in Russia by different groups? How stable is Putin's government? And how might those factors shape how Russia and Ukraine choose to fight this war moving towards its ultimate conclusion? Before concluding with a reflection on what that means for the war to come, and how long we might expect it to continue. Before I jump into the first part of the recorded interview, I thought I'd provide a quick introduction to Anders himself. As well as being a familiar face on YouTube, Anders is an officer and a military analyst based at the Royal Danish Defence College. As an analyst, he's had a long-term focus on Russia. He speaks the language and wrote on Russia and the Russian military for many years before the outbreak of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It's that focus on the Russian perspective that I'm hoping to draw out today. I'll note that all views expressed are his personal ones, and with no further ado, cut to the interview. So I thought I'd throw to the question of Russia first, because there's a lot of commentary on what Putin might be trying to do in Ukraine. Obviously, I don't think either of us subscribe to the view that the original invasion went according to plan and that they probably expected a different result than they now have and a different war than the one they're fighting in 2023. And I thought I'd open the floor to you to express your thoughts on how Moscow may be seeing the war at this point and how they may be trying to navigate it towards a particular end.
Yeah, sure. I think, of course, when we look at it from the Russian perspective, and it's always important to know that there's not one single actor that is Moscow, right? So there are many different ideas of victory. But I think if we start with Putin, then I think basically his idea of victory in Ukraine is more or less unchanged from when the war started. He sees Russia in a kind of existential struggle with the West. He sees Russia being in a situation where they have to defend themselves against a long-term threat from abroad. And that is the fight that is unfolding in Ukraine. So there can be different ways that this can go in the short term, but in the longer perspective, that existential struggle between the West and Russia, it's real, and Putin believes that he's right in doing what he can to change that direction and to defend Russia over the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades down the road. So I think that existential struggle there from the Russian perspective, it's very much there. And then of course, depending on how things are going, that can play out differently on the ground in Ukraine. So, I mean, in the beginning of the invasion, there were very different ideas about how this would go. It would be a quick war. It would be kind of sweeping victory, and Russia would kind of create this fait accompli situation for NATO. And obviously that didn't work out at all. So now they're fighting for some regions in eastern Ukraine. They're maybe fighting about the future of Ukraine. Sort of is Ukraine, how aligned is Ukraine going to be with NATO, for example, going forward? Those kinds of questions. But I think essentially Putin still believes that this is an important existential struggle for Russia. So the theory of victory would be something that somehow creates the conditions for Russia to thrive, also in the longer perspective, and to get the upper hand in that competition, to undermine that U.S.-led world order, move towards the multipolar system, those kinds of things. And then obviously, we also very quickly get into questions about regime security in Russia as well, because the way that this has developed is it has also developed into something that is a problem for the Putin regime itself, and maybe the future, and can threaten that. But I don't think Putin personally distinguishes so much between the future of Russia and the future of his regime, because in his worldview, his regime is super important for Russia.
State.
Yes, exactly.
A little bit of an I am the state situation.
Exactly. He is the state. He was the person who brought Russia out of the mess that was the 1990s, who sort of restored Russia's place in the world order. And without him, Russia's going to fall back into that, right? So that is his idea about it. So, sometimes people talk a lot about how Russia is this kleptocratic system where all the actors at the top are just doing whatever they can to steal as much as personal enrichment, right? But to a large extent, they actually do believe that this is what is best for Russia, because they are what's best for Russia.
Now, I have two questions on that point that would be great to get your thoughts on. And the first is describing this war as existential for Russia. The thinking that goes into that, because it's very hard to construct a world where, had Russia not invaded, the Russian state would actually be in any sort of danger. Or that even in a scenario where, let's just say, Ukraine had joined NATO, joined the European Union, there are NATO forces, the eastern flank now includes Ukraine, it's still very hard to construct an actual existential threat to the Russian state in a strategic point of view out of that. So how does the Russian thinking construct an existential threat out of the situation in January 2022 and now?
Well, I think there are two things that help there. The first one is that it's not Russia necessarily as Russia as a state in itself, but it's more Russia as a great power, right? That Russia's rightful place in the world is to be a great power. Great powers have spheres of influence and those kinds of things, and losing Ukraine to NATO would undermine Russia's place as a great power. So you might have Russia in itself might continue to exist, but Russia will no longer have that place that they're supposed to have in the world. And then I think it's also about the long perspective, that we're looking decades ahead here, that this is about correcting a wrong that has unfolded over 3 decades since 1991, right, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And this is about reversing that trend. So, we can't continue down this path, because then where we will end up in a decade or two is that Russia is going to be demoted into some kind of another vassal state in an American sphere of influence, right? And that would be losing in that Russian perspective. So I think we need to see the longer perspective, and we need to understand it as a great power perspective.
So the Ukraine's trajectory was a threat not so much to Russian security as Russian interests and Russia's desire to be a great power, as the Soviet Union once was.
Yeah, it's also Russia's security in the sense that losing Ukraine in that sense as a buffer zone, as a sphere of influence, that was, in Putin's worldview, that was dangerous because it would undermine Russia's ability to act as a great power going forward.
In terms of that long view then, most of the spheres of competition for great powers, economic, political, diplomatic, it's not normally conventional force-on-force fighting, especially not in the nuclear age. So Russia's environment now, fighting this war, is an immense expenditure of very finite national resources, spending down the National Wealth Fund, cutting down revenues, converting industry over to defence production, deep losses in domestic civilian manufacturing, a lot of disruptions to Russia's longevity and ability to compete in any field that is not the conventional military conflict that's now happening. So my question is, from the Russian point of view, as you assess it, how do they convert the idea that we might be able to seize some dirt in Ukraine, we might be able to pinch off some oblasts, make a peace deal and go from there, against the expenditure in very finite financial, human, industrial, capital resources that they're going to need to do to get there? And how does that actually set Russia up, in their view, in a better sense for a long-term conflict? Because I would imagine that from a material sense, Russia was playing a pretty strong hand before it invaded and has in fact started to cannibalize its long-term competitiveness to try and score this military victory in the short run.
Yeah, that's where this is not necessarily rational, right?
Okay, so it's probably not a good plan.
No.
Okay.
So I think Putin made many mistakes in that assessment, but I think his worldview was this idea that this is necessary to secure Russia in the long run. I mean, and it's worth it because it is actually an existential threat to the idea of Russia as a great power. And that's also why I think Ukraine is right when they say that, we can't make a bad peace deal, for example. If we make some kind of bad peace deal where Russia gets to keep some of what they got, then that's just going to lead to another war in a couple of years because Russia's existential ambitions with the war have not changed. I think from a Russian perspective, the vision of victory definitely does not involve just getting a few oblasts in Ukraine and then Ukraine joining NATO, for example. I think that would be considered in sort of Russian leadership as a kind of defeat. Actually, it would not solve the problems that they actually went to war for. They did not go to war just to take a couple of oblasts in eastern Ukraine. They had much bigger ambitions.
And given the resource consumption, would that arguably put them in a worse position than when they started?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they would have spent a lot of resources on a war that didn't actually lead to anything particular. I mean, if the war ends where they are now, I think that from a Russian perspective would look like a pretty bad result. First of all, they don't even control all the areas that they claim that they wrote into the constitution that is Russian territory. So, if the war ends where the front line is today, then from a Russian perspective, that would mean leaving parts of Russia under the control of a foreign government. Like, that's definitely not a vision of victory.
And potentially a NATO-aligned government.
Yes, exactly.
If things develop in that direction.
But I think there is also in this whole idea about is it worth the resources? I think there's also perhaps from a Russian perspective a misunderstanding of their own resources compared to what the willingness of other countries to keep supporting Ukraine. So if they have the impression that, okay, we're spending enormous resources right now, but our determination is much greater than the Western determination, for example, then that is maybe good enough.
So is the theory then, because I know perhaps the most commonly cited theory is that Russia intends now to basically grind this out, fight an attritional conflict, fight a positional war with no real dreams of massive advancements, with the hope that eventually the supplies to Ukraine dry up, and as a result, Ukrainian conventional capabilities peter away and they're able to pressure out some sort of deal. Is that the pathway that you see them currently following? Do you believe that represents Russia's strategic thinking at the moment?
Well, I think it's hard to see what alternatives they have. Like that looks like the plan they have to believe in, right? Because they don't. I don't really see Russia having the resources for another big offensive. For example, they had the winter offensive. I don't see them being able to, in the short to medium term, build the resources to really get on the offensive, conquer more terrain in Ukraine, for example. So Russia's plan has to be to just last this out and be sure that they can continue longer than Ukraine can, and that the Western partners for Ukraine. There is also in Russia this general idea that the West is weak. I mean, that it is a deep-found assumption about how the world works, that Russians have great determination and the West is weak and decadent, and essentially what people in the West care about is it's money and it's luxury goods and those kinds of things. So know the Western determination will end at some point. So I think this is a deep felt belief in the Russian leadership that, if all these other things don't work, then we can always just wait it out because the Americans are going to elect another president or Germans are going to lose determination or what have you.
And it is an interesting question. And I know we'll pivot to talking about the thinking in Western capitals on supporting Ukraine and what the long-term sustainability there might be. The question on the sustainability of the Russian approach itself is an interesting one because you've highlighted that we've seen the way they do offensive operations has changed. Originally, it was large-scale sweeping offensives on multiple fronts. Then we saw small offensives on several fronts. And most recently, a small offensive on one front in Luhansk and defense everywhere else, as steadily that offensive potential appears to have shrunk. And now both sides seem to mostly use small units, localized offensives, grinding out positional advances, not really sweeping ones. And yet that's still extremely demanding in terms of resource consumption. My question, I think, in terms of long-term sustainability, maybe this is to pivot it to my area for a moment, but I'm happy to get your thoughts, is a lot of what Russia is consuming at the moment is not new production. It's not new material that they're able to produce. They're trying to increase production, and we constantly try and do calculations and try and guesstimate what Russian defense industry is capable of producing, but the answer is always significantly short of current consumption. But the Soviet Union and then some rearmament in the 2010s meant that there's an awful lot of ammunition, equipment, material available in storage yards. That's depleting incredibly quickly for a European audience. Is there a sign that Russia thinks that is a sustainability issue? Or is the assumption got to be that this war will be over before we start talking about 2025, 2026, and those problems become acute?
I will say that for a long time, people have said that Russia is thinking the long-term perspective. They want the long war because they believe this is better. I will say I did not actually see those signs early on.
Is this more the Russia kicking the can down the road theory? The way that they held off on mobilization for a long time, and then they made the decision when there was no other one, hoping that something might change in the immediate future. Is there still a sort of short-termism to Russian decision-making, even if the plan has sort of a long-term view? This is obviously very hard to tell from an external perspective looking in, but looking at the decisions that are made in series, is there any inference, do you think, we can make there?
No, I think that's still a case. I mean, right, we can talk about the question of mobilization, for example. Another wave of mobilization, is Russia going to come out with a second wave? I think it's long overdue. They haven't done that. I think one of the reasons is probably the regional elections coming up in Russia. I mean, it's not real elections, but that's what they call them. They like to keep sort of this impression of having elections, and they are coming up in September. And I think there is a very good chance that another wave of mobilization will come on the other side of that, maybe late September, October. So those kinds of decisions do seem to be delayed due to concerns about short-term domestic politics in Russia. Obviously, they are concerned about the consumption of goods. I mean, like, they are trying to boost production, for example, in the military-industrial complex. But we're not at a point yet where it has pushed everything else aside, and there is still a balancing act going on. Also, we have Putin's, let's call it, re-election coming up next year. It's also going to be important in all this.
It's an interesting point in terms of Russia having made several times decisions that seem to sacrifice military utility for domestic popularity. So, for example, the observation that we've seen Brucey and others make is that in 2022, Russia probably sacrificed more material than it had to because the units were fundamentally undermanned. And even though Russia has this demographic advantage, there has seldom actually been that much of a manpower advantage in this war, simply because Ukraine has a much greater willingness to mobilize and is gated more by their materiel than Russia. And Russia has sometimes been the one suffering manpower shortages, which seems incomprehensible from a country of that size that has conscription on the books. So the question is, does that reflect a genuine concern about domestic popularity and stability? And to what extent is that perceived as an actual issue in Moscow?
It's definitely a concern. I mean, from a purely military perspective, they should have done it long ago, right? They say, and they haven't done that. And the only explanation I can see is that Putin is concerned about how the Russian population will react to it. Are they going to accept this? What will it take for the Russian population to accept a higher degree of mobilization? And I think they came out of the mobilization wave in 2022, in the fall of 2022, thinking that this went pretty well. I mean, afterward there were some protests, but after all, it was manageable. But it was also an easier wave of mobilization. Like the more mobilization they have to do, the harder it will get to find those people that will not protest too much, and the more they will have to mobilize also from the population centers in St. Petersburg and Moscow, where the protest potential is significant. So Putin will somehow have to get the Russian population more on board with this idea over time if the war drags out. But, I mean, he's definitely kicking the can down the road and maybe thinking that over time people will get more used to the idea of a war going on.
Because just to close out this idea, we focus a lot on, I think, the missed opportunities from the Ukrainian side, where often they will say we could have generated a lot of additional combat power, a lot of additional units, had we received more material aid sooner, and there were missed opportunities. I don't think what we talk about as much is the missed Russian opportunities on force generation, wherein if mobilization had come sooner and harder and had been more focus on getting new units generated quickly, the Russian military might be in much better shape now than it currently is. And by putting off these decisions, there's a lot of utility that's probably being sacrificed there, which to me at least makes projecting the future trajectory of the combat power of the Russian army very difficult, because you have to make assumptions around when the Kremlin will choose to do unpopular things that have military utility, like fully mobilizing the economy or pulling additional people into the military.
Yes, exactly. And I think you can even point to conscript units and say, they actually do have these units ready. I mean, they're ready to go, but they're not using them because it would be unpopular. The moment they send conscripts to the war, then, so many families all around Russia with some young man soon to enter conscription will be very concerned. So there is a great protest potential in that. I mean, I sometimes think of it in terms of Clausewitz's distinction between limited and unlimited wars, that you have unlimited wars where everything is, this is an existential war. If we don't win this fight, then we won't exist anymore, so we throw everything at it. Then you have limited wars where it's like, okay, we fight this war, but it's not our number one priority as a state. And I think essentially what we're witnessing here is the difference between Ukraine. For Ukraine, this is an unlimited war. This is the number one priority, and they're willing to throw everything they have at it. And for Russia, it is still a limited war. They have to balance the war effort against all kinds of other concerns.
Which is interesting when you say the Russian government views this as existential, but also as limited, wherein you're saying that you view something as absolute in its potential consequences, but we're only going to use limited means in order to achieve it because we're not willing to make the hard decision to go to a more unlimited employment of national resources. I'll add one final question here on sustainability, and then perhaps we can move on. And that is, the other part of Russian mobilization wasn't just calling up new men who didn't want to be there. They basically brought in stop loss. So normally the Kontrakniki finish their stint and they move out, and the rate at which they're currently recruiting is a bit higher than the replacement rate of what they would normally need to replace people who are exiting, but they basically stop people exiting. To what extent do we have to factor in the consequences of basically troops who thought they were signing up for 12 months potentially now being in for 3 or 4 years? And does that pose its own sort of social consequences, or does no one care about the Kontrakniki who are now in for the duration?
Well, let me first address the first question about how can this be an existential war but still a limited one. I think it's the question of regime stability that comes into there, that the Putin regime, they clearly recognize that if they fall due to internal circumstances inside of Russia, then that would also mean losing that existential fight that they see with the West in the long term. So that's why they have to keep balancing these things. And that's going to continue. And then the question about the stop loss thing and how where are we going to see the effects long term in the Russian society? I think there is a pretty big potential for in Russia for sort of living with these things, absorbing these things, but it is going to materialize over time. And as the war goes on, then it is going to influence the Russian society more and more. It will be more and more impossible to shield the average Russian population, sort of from the realities of the war, these people will start to come home. More wounded people will start to come home. People with all kinds of addictions, people will return home.
All the scars of war.
Yeah, exactly. All those things. It is going to change the Russian society long term. I think we saw that very clearly in the 1980s with the Soviet-Afghan war. But it takes time. I mean, when the invasion started in Ukraine, I thought it was going to be a pretty quick one. I thought that once Russia realized they can't actually achieve these big goals they have in the beginning, then Putin is going to be smart enough to end this thing, come up with some kind of excuse and pull out. He didn't do that, and I think we're now in it for the long run.
I do feel like I was something of an outlier in early 2022 when I was talking about a long-term conflict in which all of these attritional factors have become relevant. Depressingly, that seems to be now where I think more of the analysis is now pointing, and people are more openly talking about 2024, 2025, potentially 2026, unless there's some sort of political change or social change in any of the combatants, because that's where the material resources start to reach their theoretical limits if the war doesn't terminate sooner, which is a depressing reality, but also one that you would expect the combatants to have to be preparing for to shape their negotiating positions in the event they want to terminate the war earlier than that. So is that perhaps a good opening to try and switch to the other side of the conflict and ask how the Ukrainians see this, that possibility of a long war, what their theory is, what their pathway to it is, and then sort of pivot into the West from there?
Sure.
So onto the Ukrainians then. So here we've got the combination of probably objectively existential conflict, because if Russia was to achieve all of its initial war aims, the concept of a free and independent Ukraine that is free to associate with NATO and the European Union probably wouldn't exist. The initial justification of demilitarization and that great one, denazification, which I think was generally interpreted as some form of regime change or regime influence. I think that's the best way to interpret that justification, combined with relatively unlimited means, wherein the way Ukraine seems to use its resources is limited only by the sensibilities of perhaps its Western partners or the limitations it places on its weapons. And in the absence of those, we would probably be seeing storm shadows flung into Russia as opposed to just limited to Ukrainian territory. That rate of consumption is obviously very taxing on Ukrainian society, but the question is, from your perspective, what is the current Ukrainian theory of what victory looks like and how to get there?
Yeah, the first thing I want to note is that Ukraine is a big country. So I think sometimes, at least in the beginning of the war, there was a tendency to exaggerate the size difference between Russia and Ukraine. Russia, population-wise, is about 3.5 times bigger than Ukraine. But there was this David and Goliath picture that often being floated around. I often expressed it in the way, I mean, I'm from Denmark. I say 3.5 times. How would that sort of measure up? And it's about, if Denmark and Sweden decided that we're going to invade Norway, right? That's about the size difference in population. And I think Norway would be able to handle that.
I was going to say, good luck with the Norwegian terrain on that one.
Yes, I would not be certain that this is a sure victory. So I think there was some, especially on the Russian side, but also many Western analysts sort of underestimated what Ukraine is capable of and what their potential is. And, they can keep this up for a long time. It's going to be costly, but I'm not sure that Russia actually has this advantage in the long run. I think to the question of what is Ukraine's vision of victory, then it is very much outlined in their peace plan that they've put out. It is a vision that involves getting all the territory back, including Crimea. It's about prosecution of war crimes. It's about war reparations. It's about a future where they have political independence and they have security guarantees by being a member of NATO, for example. So this is essentially that's the whole package, right? That's the vision of what is victory like for Ukraine.
And then the theory of how to get there, because that is, as you say, that's the full package. It's Ukraine's 91 borders, but on that geopolitical map, it turns blue. It's in NATO, it's in the EU. It is the new eastern flank in that part of the world, rather than any sort of enforced neutral status, which is often seems to be Russian code for eternally vulnerable. So a Ukraine that does not have the benefit of a genuine sort of security alliance behind it. We're seeing a very slow deliberate style of fighting now in terms of the Ukrainian offensive. It originally seemed like they tried a couple of breakthrough maneuvers. Those did not work. They didn't throw the whole force into it, but it didn't turn out very well. And we've now seen a return to grinding, a lot of counter battery, small infantry units, small mech infantry units making very small, deliberate advances. Is the theory now that they will slowly grind Russia back to its original positions, or is this a political strategy, or is it some combination of the two?
I think Ukraine is following two tracks simultaneously. The first one is getting all the terrain back, meter by meter. And yes, when the counteroffensive began in May, June, there were probably hopes that it would go faster than it did. But essentially, the plan is still the same. I think it's just winning back the territory, pushing the Russians out. And now it turned out it takes a bit of attrition first.
Is that one of the big observations I know we need to be careful from a military perspective about overlearning lessons in conventional war from the specific circumstances that we're seeing in Ukraine. But that relationship between attrition and maneuver has been talked about an awful lot, wherein wherever we have seen maneuver be successful, it's either been preceded by strategic surprise, like the initial Russian offensives from the north and the south. The Donbass attack seems to have been expected, Kyiv in the south not so much, or by a period of attrition. Kharkiv, where the units there were really quite worn down and the front line was pretty sparse before Ukraine was able to move through. Is there a broader military lesson that forces should probably be looking at there and testing against their own current doctrine and theories?
Yeah, I think so. And I think also many armies maybe have forgotten that attrition part of it because in Western doctrine, that is very much delegated to the Air Force. So if we take for a moment and imagine Operation Desert Storm, for example, without an air campaign, then maybe we can get an idea about what it is Ukraine has to do now, right? It's a very, very different kind of war than what we actually saw play out in Desert Storm. So definitely attrition plays a role in enabling maneuver, and maybe there was a bit of undue optimism about what could be achieved if Ukraine just get some Bradleys and some Leopard tanks. And it turned out that's not, it wasn't actually, they need more than that. It also takes some kind of attrition. And I think that's also why, I mean, just before we talked about how this war may take years more. I mean, this may even still be the early phases of the war, maybe the end of the beginning or something like that. I mean, we don't know that yet. But that is also why I think so sometimes I hear people saying that it doesn't really make sense to talk about this F-16s to Ukraine because it will take too long to implement these fighters and to build up a Ukrainian Air Force. Yes, but if we think ahead and we think this war may continue into 2026, 2027, then, it may make the difference that we begin building the Ukrainian Air Force now. That may be what in the long run will make this winnable for Ukraine, right?
Well, the question is also political, because if we've just said we believe that Russia's theory is it can eventually grind this out, then surely committing equipment that is only going to arrive over the long term, like solidifying that pipeline, is a pretty strong, in game theory, a costly signal. A signal that isn't free, indicating that there will still be military capacity being fed through this system, which makes it hard to be optimistic about your odds of just wearing down the Ukrainian force. It would be pretty depressing, for example, if the VKS looks at this situation and says, we have just spent the better part of 2 years mostly eroding the existing Ukrainian fixed-wing fleet, and then it's just going to be replaced with a more capable platform in greater numbers, and we're going to have to start the whole process all over again. So is there an interrelationship there between committing to long-term build-up of military capability and that negotiating position and expectation management at that strategic signaling level?
It absolutely, it does improve the negotiating position for Ukraine. It does, theoretically at least, improve the willingness of the Russians to look into negotiations, to understand that they have to, that this is unsustainable, that they're going to lose in the long run. But I think the problem, though, is that for the Putin regime, there isn't really any alternative. I don't see personally how Putin can actually compromise on the things that are necessary for any kind of peace deal. So that is, I mean, it's not possible for him to do anything that is even remotely close to the Ukrainian peace plan and then expect to remain in power in Russia. So I think personally, for Russia to actually engage in serious negotiations, then we are probably, beyond Putin's time as a leader of Russia. So, and that actually is a good segue into the other. But before I said Ukraine is following two tracks. One is this winning back the territory meter by meter. But I think the other one we are seeing Ukraine following right now is to destabilize Russia politically. That Ukraine has recognized that the Putin regime is unstable, that political change in Russia is possible. We just saw that just a couple of months ago with the Wagner mutiny, how fragile this is.
The road trip to Moscow.
Yes, whatever that was. But it clearly demonstrated that there is some potential for protests from several angles.
If not members of the public, members of the elite who have access to some sort of muscle.
Yes, and these things can very quickly interact, boost each other. So I think it looks to me like the Ukrainians understand how weak the political system in Russia is, despite how solid it can appear from the outside, and that it is an important ingredient in how they can win the war to actually, maybe cause some kind of regime change, but at least increase the domestic pressure on the Russian government to make them feel that it's actually, from a regime change point of view, it's the danger of continuing the war is bigger than ending the war. So that's how I personally view, for example, the drone attacks that we see on Moscow, those kinds of things, as Ukraine trying to put increased pressure on the Russian society, bring the war home to the Russians in order to undermine Putin's grasp on power, and that this is an important part of Ukraine's sort of vision of how to achieve victory. Maybe not the end state, but the road.
It's an interesting point because you're never going to do significant material strategic damage using a couple of drones with 20-kilogram payloads hitting government buildings in a capital. You might send a signal that things are not going according to plan because the plan probably didn't include strikes on Moscow in the second year of the conflict. But doing hard strategic damage with those sort of weapon systems probably out the window. So your interpretation on that is it's about image and it's about signaling to the Russian elite and the Russian population.
Yeah, I think there are two goals. Basically, one is to undermine the idea that this war is under control. The special military operation is under control. Now, a year and a half into the conflict, suddenly we see regular drone attacks on the capital. And over time, if this continues, if it even intensifies, then that might be a serious problem for the Russian propaganda machine to keep explaining why this is happening. And then I think the other goal is just to force the Russians to allocate air defense to Moscow instead of being able to use it in Ukraine.
Well, and then that's an interesting point because we're talking about a scarce resource from a Ukrainian perspective here because we're also seeing very frequent drone attacks, for example, on oil depot, ammunition, air bases, locations in Crimea. So every time a Beaver or a long-range strike platform is launched at Moscow, it's one that isn't being launched at a military target in Crimea. So clearly there has to be some sort of calculation going on there. Is the value in political attention and whatever G-badge you're pulling off to defend Moscow worth diverting some of those strike assets from military targets in Crimea? And I'd hate to be the person who's having to do those calculations in the Ukrainian General Staff.
It's very hard. I think from a Russian perspective, it's also, you get into all kinds of, they also have to make these calculations, where do we prioritize the defense here? And I think this is one of those areas where we could have the military saying one thing, so we need this air defense in Crimea, for example. That's the most important. But we have a political wing in the Kremlin saying, no, we can't allow these drone attacks to be successful in Moscow City. So you also create those tensions within the Russian system through these drone attacks.
Now, at this phase in the interview, we'd started to talk about the political divisions within Russia for the first time in any serious detail. We'd flagged that influencing Russian politics was probably part of Ukraine's strategy, part of its theory of victory. But what we hadn't done is stepped back and talked about how power and opinion is segmented in the Russian system. And so a little bit later on, I asked Anders exactly that question. How is Russian government and Russian society segmented, and where do the various groups stand in relation to the war? Anders' comments were as follows.
Well, I think if we look at it from the perspective of the Russian population, then I think we can say that there are generally three different groups that we can talk about. There is a group that is clearly anti-war, liberal, supporters of Russia being a European normal country, those kinds of things. And that is about 15 to 20% of the population. Even the official opinion polls in Russia show this, that there is this group of people. So these are the people that support Navalny or other opposition figures that want Russia to be more European and are very much anti-war. Then we have another group of people, also about 15 to 20%, that are on the sort of opposite wing. So those are the ultranationalists, those who really have big ambitions about Russia as a great power, as an empire, and want to restore some of that. And their criticism of Putin is, they're just as critical of Putin as the liberalists are. They just do it from the different angle. So their problem with the war is not that they're against the war. Their criticism of the war is that it's not being done well enough, right? So they want a better war. And then we have the last group is sort of those in the middle, those that support Putin. So that's somewhere between 60 and 70%. And those 60 to 70%, it's not that all these people all support Putin necessarily, but just a large part of them are just maybe indifferent. They don't really seem to have any opinion as such, and then they just back the system. And I think one of the important things when we talk about the Russian population is the concept of what we can say is being depoliticized. We often say that the Russian population is decoupled from the political processes, that they don't see themselves as someone with political agency. And this is actually kind of by design by Putin. He spent many of his first years in power really trying to create a separation between a private sphere where people could sort of live their personal lives and then a political sphere in society where people would just basically stay out of politics. So there was this kind of deal that, okay, Putin could deliver some economic benefits, some progress, some security, and people could keep on having personal freedom, travel the world, make businesses, whatever they wanted to, as long as they stayed out of politics. So you have in the Russian society very much this impression among many Russians that the way to a good life is not to get involved with politics. And this is one of the big jokers in this whole thing, because we don't really know how these depoliticized people will react if eventually they are forced to getting politically engaged. And we see those waves of mobilization, for example. Eventually it will be really hard to maintain that illusion that politics don't have anything to do with my life and it's possible for me to stay out of politics if suddenly I personally am mobilized or someone that I care about, someone from my family is being mobilized into the war. Then suddenly the war becomes a very personal thing. So that is one of the things that Putin is really concerned about, how these depoliticized people in the Russian society, how they're going to react. And if they suddenly do get politically engaged, for whom are they going to be politically engaged? Are they going to engage on the pro-war side of things or on the anti-war side of things? And if they do engage on the pro-war side of things, are they going to engage on those that support Putin's line with the war, or are they going to be critical of the way the war is being conducted and engage in a sort of anti-corruption kind of pro-war sentiment where you want a better war, you want all those incompetent generals taken away, so there can be a better war. So that's some of the things we have going on in the Russian society, in the population as such. And then if we look inside the government, I think we can say there is also we can also see there are different kinds of groups. There's a group of politicians that play different roles in the Russian state system. It's very important for Russia to keep this sort of illusion of democracy. So they do have things that they call elections. People actually do go and vote. They have things that are sort of have the appearance of opposition parties, but they play a very, very particular role in the system. It's all very well orchestrated, but they're there to sort of give that
legitimacy to the system and to pick up voters that maybe are not want to vote for Putin's party, but then vote for one of these other kind of protest parties that exist within the system and are still under the control of the system. But generally, you can say that the politicians in Russia tend to be very opportunistic, not driven by any particular kind of ideology, but very much driven by what makes sense, what can give power, what can give resources. So that's a very opportunistic kind of way of looking at it. Then we have what can be called the technocrats within the system. So that's those people like the head of the central bank, for example, these kinds of people that work to just make the system work and generally tend to be very competent, have good education, good understanding of what's going on, and they tend to maybe be a bit dissatisfied that this thing has come in and made their jobs very, very difficult, but they still do whatever they can to make the Russian system work as well as it's possible, to see how can we get around sanctions, how can we still, under these circumstances, have a society that works. And then we have the group that's called the Siloviki, or the strongmen, which is the military leadership. It is the National Guard, the police forces, like these people that have some kind of muscle to work for them, and that they play this role as those that keep order in the Russian system. Those are maybe the three groups that I would say we have. So it's sort of some very opportunistic politicians. We have some technocrats that try to make the system work, the bureaucracy function, and then we have the Siloviki play a kind of different role where they are somehow engaged. Many of them are engaged, of course, in the war in Ukraine, but they also have roles in keeping the Russian system stable and preventing any kind of public uprising and those kinds of things. But I think it's important to also understand that Russia is very much ruled through informal structures. So that is personal alliances, groups of people that somehow help each other. And the way Putin's system generally works is very much a divide and rule kind of system, where Putin will make sure that different groups in the government system will be competing with each other, and then they will sort of keep each other in check. And that is a way that Putin can ensure his own power, and he can coup-proof the system, because there will be so many different sort of small rulers in the system that sort of compete with each other and are willing to tell on each other. So we have this divide and rule kind of structure, and it also means that Putin's role in the system, it's actually not a very streamlined organization, the Russian bureaucracy. It wasn't before the war. Before the war, I think there was very much this tendency for people to assume that Putin had all the power in the country. That was not the case at all. The way the Russian system works is much more that you have these different groups of people or individuals actually trying to do some things, and then they're competing with each other. And then we have Putin kind of sitting on top as the arbiter, we could say like a referee that sort of steps in when there are problems or disputes have to be settled in different ways, and then he can decide how to divide the resources. And that means that also inside the Russian system, it's really hard to get a clear picture of who is with whom, and who is competing with whom, and how these alliances can sort of build and where they actually are, because it's very much informal, all of it.
Jumping ahead again, I also had to ask another follow-up, because by this point we'd used the term political instability a lot. But given that we're talking about a system of government whereby defeat in an open election followed by a peaceful transfer of power probably isn't the most likely way for a regime to end, I asked Anders what political instability realistically means in a Russian context and what it might look like from the outside looking in.
Like regional elections coming up this September. Next year there will be a presidential election. These are actually big deals for the Putin regime because it gives that legitimacy, and they don't want to end up in the situation that Lukashenko had in Belarus in 2020, when the elections were so rigged that it was absolutely obvious to everyone. They want it to be, I mean, of course, they're rigged to some extent. They're not free and fair elections at all, but they don't want to have to rig them too badly, because then that undermines the legitimacy. They want the Russians to be able to say that, okay, I kind of think that there is a majority of Russians that actually support Putin, because that does give the system legitimacy. The threats that I think there are several threats facing the Putin regime, and as the war goes on, these things it's going to be worse because the war brings out these things. But we have, of course, a threat coming from the liberal side of the argument. So that is the Navalny system, for example. So when we talk about the threats to the Putin regime, there are different kinds of threats, of course, and I think we can say the war will just intensify this over the coming years. If the war continues, then these threats will be more tangible. But of course, we can see public protests, so there can be something from sort of the population coming out from a bottom-up kind of a protest, or we can talk about a palace coup, something happening in the elite that they get rid of Putin for whatever reason, and see if they can pull that off. I think when we talk about public protests, then in general, the Putin regime is pretty good at managing those anti-war liberal protesters. They know how to deal with that. They have a long experience of doing that, and they can always sort of say that these people are basically Western agents that are unpatriotic and trying to undermine our system. So they kind of know how to deal with that. So we're going to continue seeing that, and I think the anti-war movement in Russia is probably going to grow over time, but we also should assume that they have a pretty good idea about how to handle that threat. A much more difficult kind of threat comes from the other side, the ultranationalist opposition to Putin. Those that blame his government for being incompetent, blame corruption and incompetent generals for the failures in the war, for example. Those that basically try to outcompete Putin on patriotism. That is a much more difficult kind of opposition for him to manage, because being the patriotic leader of the nation was very much that which gave him legitimacy until the war started, and now there are very strong voices coming from attacking him from the right for not being patriotic enough, or for not siding with the soldiers, for example. Like also in Russia, there is this movement like support our troops and these kinds of things. So when you end up in these situations where it looks like there is a conflict between the military leadership, the Ministry of Defense, for example, that they don't provide the things that the soldiers need on the ground, then who do you support here? Right? And if you can suddenly turn that into a criticism of Putin, that means that if you are a patriotic Russian and you support our troops, then you have to be against this system that doesn't provide the things our troops need. Like, that kind of criticism is much more dangerous for Putin, and it's clear that he has been uncertain about how to deal with this. So we had Igor Girkin, for example, running around coming with some very stark criticism for a very long time. Now he's in prison, but it's a very recent thing, and clearly Putin has been unsure about how to deal with that. And then also from inside the government system, we've also seen that things can suddenly evolve. Like there was the Wagner mutiny that maybe not could have turned into a coup if things had gone differently back in June. It can be very hard to see inside the system from outside. Like it can be kind of a black box where it can be a little mystical what's going on inside there. But I think if we are to see a successful regime change situation in Russia, then what we're going to see is that it's probably going to be a kind of combination of things, like both things happening from below, like popular protests, and it's going to be things from above, things happening inside the elite system where people suddenly decide to take the opportunity, or things that just go hand in hand. And what we will see is probably that I don't think we should necessarily imagine this as being so much that the system takes over control over Putin, but maybe rather that the system stops working. Right? So you have this situation where there can be some kind of popular uprising, for example, protests, and suddenly those people whose job it is to go out and take care of these protests, hand out the beatings, suddenly these people decide not to do their job. We saw that actually in 1991 when there was the August coup in the Soviet Union. The Moscow police department was actually absolutely incapable of doing anything because so many police officers called in sick in those days, right? So the police force just stopped working. And I think something like that is possible again. Like it was the Wagner mutiny in June, what we saw was actually that it kind of looked like the National Guard was not doing anything. So it looked like they were just kind of waiting to see what direction is this going and who's going to win, and then maybe that's who we will support. So I think that kind of dynamic where the system basically just stops working, that is what will open the possibilities of regime change eventually.
And again, the key question I wanted to ask here was around what the externally visible signs would be. We can do things like try and assess military losses by looking at photos of destroyed equipment, for example. But what are some of the factors that external analysts might look for as indicators or contraindicators of Russian political instability?
I think that the signals to look for is those signals that show that the Putin regime is working harder to maintain control, or signs that it is impossible or at least harder for them to maintain the level of control that they had earlier. So when we see them cracking down on protests in a different way, when we see them cracking down on VPN connections, because apparently that's important for them, that people don't get information from other sources, when we see them trying to dismantle the Wagner group in some way after the mutiny, that mutiny was an obvious, very, very clear, visible example of instability. Like that, if a mutiny is not instability, then what is, right? So those kinds of things where Putin is has to really work harder to maintain the stability in the country, that shows that there is instability. So I think that is what we can see best, because if we look for those specific examples of where are the protests or who inside the government said what, like it's just impossible for us to see those alliances forming, for example, inside the government system. But we can definitely see that there are things going on. Like now that there was a mutiny, then we had Russian generals being detained. We had the chief of the Air Force, Siloviki, being out of public focus suddenly. These are all examples of how the Russian system is working harder to try to keep some kind of instability. So I think those are some of the visible signals. And then I will also say that we should look for things where discussions happen that didn't happen before, like people starting talking about a future, like a post-Putin world, like a future without Putin. What would that be like? And I think that is one of the areas where people sometimes underestimate the impact of Prigozhin's mutiny in June. That what he did was, in essence, he kind of broke the taboo of talking about maybe it is possible to imagine a future without Putin. And we've seen other people doing that afterwards. So we've seen after the mutiny, we have seen other conversations with people talking openly about, well, maybe Russia does need a different kind of leader. So we've had people like Girkin, but also others. And this, I mean, every time we see these things on a small level, then of course it's happening on a much bigger level in different places in the Russian system. So whenever there are these kinds of discussions, then that shows that this is something that is that is also happening inside the system. But those examples where we suddenly see the Russian population getting more politically engaged, where we see them taking stances, where we see them protesting, and it doesn't really matter what they're protesting about, just the fact that they see themselves as having some kind of political agency where they protest against something, then that is examples of growing instability in Russia. And so I think those are some of the examples we should look for.
Which leads, I think, to the final question of this segment, which is what sort of strategies can Ukraine embrace to try and create these sort of instabilities? And what sort of capabilities are they going to need if they're going to try and do so?
Okay, so I think really what we see is Ukraine is following several tracks. There is the military track, of course, where they are trying to push the Russians out, but also they're really trying to play on this political instability in Russia, that they see Russia as a weak state, and they see some opportunities here for maybe that could be a way to win the war by actually undermining the stability of the Russian system so that eventually the Russian effort collapses. I think we're going to see them doing what they can. I think there is a lot going on already that we probably don't see. I mean, there are the drone attacks in Moscow. I think that is going to intensify. It is going to continue. But we've also seen other things, different kinds of sabotage, assassinations, probably also from where the Ukrainians have somehow organized that. We probably also, I would assume there is a lot going on in cyber as well. So I think Ukraine are doing what they can to see how they can do that, and of course also in the influence. Or try to influence it through the sort of the information space, so the different kind of information operations. What I want to say is I think it's important that we don't underestimate the problems or the challenges that can come out of political instability in Russia. Like, I think sometimes there is a tendency to maybe think that a world without Putin would be very good, and I think that is true. I think, generally speaking, sometimes there is this discussion about, maybe we shouldn't be too keen on having Putin replaced because whoever comes after him will be much worse. Well, personally, I think it's hard to see what could be much worse. Like, what is it that a person much worse would actually do that Putin is not doing already? So I think I'm not so concerned about what comes after Putin. My concern is that process of regime change, like that instability that can arise in that process. If we still have Putin in power, but it's very fragile, and he's facing massive popular uprisings and really can see, okay, I'm going to end up like Ceausescu in Romania if I don't do something dramatic. Like, I think it's quite possible that he might do something dramatic, right? So, and one of the things I think we also need to keep in mind is that Putin tends to see any kind of popular uprising, those sort of revolutions in dictatorships around the world, that he sees that as a kind of hybrid warfare, right? It's all orchestrated by the CIA, and so this is actually the West doing this. Like, it's of course not the Russian population would never do such a thing against me. It's got to be the CIA, and therefore he might feel justified in somehow responding outwards, right? And even if we have nothing to do with it from the West, this is totally something that is happening inside of Russia. I think there is this danger that Russia might actually respond somehow in some aggressive fashion outwards. So that is also a way that you can try to create cohesion, right? Get an external enemy. So I think we really need to think about how would we respond to that situation. Political instability in Russia might be dangerous. Are our militaries ready for that situation? How can we contain that situation so that if there is that kind of instability in Russia, that it's contained within Russia, it doesn't spread beyond Russia? Because I think Putin in that situation would be willing to try almost everything to try to keep a grab on power. I actually think that is probably also the one scenario where I would be concerned about nuclear use, like nuclear weapons. I would not rule out that. I don't think Putin is going to use nuclear weapons to win the war in Ukraine. I don't see those kinds of scenarios really playing out really well. But I could see him taking that step if he is about to lose power in Russia on a personal level, because I think he would be ready to do almost anything. So I think we really need to think that through about what it means to have political instability in Russia. It might go very well. It might not be a problem. And I think it would be a benefit for the world if Putin were replaced as president of Russia. But that process of change, I think, can potentially be dangerous, and we have to think that through. Like we can say we've done it before. It went very well in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. It was overall a pretty peaceful process. But I mean, there's no guarantee that these kinds of things are peaceful, right? And maybe we were just lucky in 1991. So we really need to be prepared for that situation and not underestimate the dangers. And in saying that, I will say that of course also means that I think the West needs to be careful about not playing an active role in bringing about that regime change in Russia. I think it has to be an internal process in Russia. Ukraine can try to push this by bringing the war to Russian territory. The drone attacks, from a Ukrainian perspective, it's a very good strategy. I think it's necessary. In the end, this has to come from within Russia. And I don't think we want the West to really play an active role in bringing about regime change in Russia. What we need to focus on is how to contain that process to only happen inside of Russia and not to escalate to other places.
At this point, our discussion became a little more free-form, moving away from the topic of Russia and putting the focus on the West and Ukraine instead, asking questions around the endurance of political support and the sustainability of Western aid. But given this video is already over an hour long, that's probably content for another time. And so I'm going to close out by offering a few thoughts of my own to build on Anders' observations. I think it's fair to say that both Russia and Ukraine have strategies in place at the moment that seek to target the political endurance on the opposing side. From a historical perspective, that's a relatively common strategy, albeit one that gives inconsistent returns. Assessing political stability and will to continue is simply so much more difficult than trying to track materiel factors. It's relatively easy to do things like count tanks, but from the outside looking into a society, it can be much harder to determine when a population is going to throw its hands up and say enough. A general historical observation might be that populations, and thus wars, tend to hold on much longer than expected. And right now, I don't think there's a sign of an imminent collapse on either side. But as long as it continues, this war is likely to impose continuously mounting costs. Whether that takes the form of soldiers coming home killed and wounded, or as we've seen in Russia, the increasing diversion of government resources away from civilian spending towards the military-industrial complex. In that sense, you might say there isn't actually a clean separation between the military and the political campaigns at all, and that the kind of ugly attritional fighting we now see playing out is as politically significant as drone strikes on Moscow or Russian information warfare targeting the West. What remains to be seen is what fails first: the sustainability of the Russian military, political and economic system on one hand, or the cohesion and capability of the alliance supporting Ukraine on the other. There's probably a further discussion to be had there, although ultimately only time will tell. But for the moment, as grim as it might be, I think the evidence suggests that both have a significant amount left in the tank, and that as a result, this war probably still has quite a way to run. For now, I'll just close by thanking Anders for hosting me here today, and for offering his thoughts on what I hope you all found to be an interesting topic. As you all know, I'm currently spending quite a lot of time in the air, so trust me when I say it was a lot easier to record at the college than in a hotel room. As always, if there are going to be any major changes to the plan, I'll make sure to put a community post up. But for the moment, I very much hope to see you all again next week.